Thank you all again for being here. My name is John Hood. I'm the president of the Pope Foundation and the former president of this organization where you're sitting, the John Locke Foundation. Looking forward to this follow-up to the presentations we've already heard, this panel discussion. And to introduce our three speakers, ask each of them to give some initial remarks, and then I'll ask a few questions based on the similarities and differences that we pick up as we hear the opening remarks, and then we'll open it up for the rest of you to ask questions. And we'll talk until they throw us out of here. So since I'm chairman of the board of this organization, they should just try. Okay. So, Mike Adams is a professor of criminology at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. He's a regular columnist at Town Hall, as you know. He's a vocal critic of the diversity movement in academia. He's made appearances on shows such as The O'Reilly Factor, Glenn Beck, and Hannity and Combs. Well, one of those still exists. Yeah. But in addition to lecturing on the First Amendment, Mike is actively involved in legal challenges to campus censorship. He's represented by the wonderful organization Alliance Defending Freedom and won that landmark First Amendment case before the Fourth Circuit in 2011. That's Adams v. UNCW. That decision held that professors publishing columns and giving speeches have the full protection of the First Amendment when discussing matters of public concern. In other words, when professors report such activities as part of their annual review, tenure, and promotion materials, the university does not have the license to discriminate on the basis of the professor's viewpoint. Mike is also the author of 3 popular books, Ivory Tower of Babel, Feminists Say the Darndest Things, a politically incorrect professor confronts women on campus, and Letters to a Young Progressive. Our second speaker will be Steve Long. He's there on the end. Steve is an attorney at Ward & Smith in Raleigh. He leads the firm's tax and employee benefits practice. He has extensive experience working with employers in banking, retail, and technology to establish and maintain retirement plans, executive compensation agreements, stock incentive plans, and other employee benefits. Steve has also worked extensively with nonprofits, including many of the organizations in North Carolina that work together to advance the cause of freedom in our state. He advises nonprofits on IRS rules and retiree benefits and fundraising and lobbying restrictions and that sort of thing. He also counsels business owners and individuals in retirement and estate planning. Now, perhaps most proximate to our conversation today, Steve is a member of the University of North Carolina Board of Governors. He was appointed to that board in 2013. He chairs the University Governance Committee and is also a member of the Strategic Initiatives Committee. Last year, he was appointed to the board of Go Global NC, which is a nonprofit that's part of the UNC system. The program is designed to connect North Carolina to the world and the world to North Carolina through international education and training programs. Our final speaker will be Jonathan Jordan there in the center. First and only time you'll be in the center. There you go. Former state representative for House District 93. He served from 2011 to 2018. He was a member of the Executive Committee of the North Carolina Republican Party. He has served as vice chair of the Ashe County Republican Party, legal counsel for the 5th Congressional District Republican Executive Committee, and a member of the Rules Committee for the North Carolina Republican State Convention in a number of different years. He practices law in Jefferson, North Carolina. He practices on real estate transactions, business and corporate law, contracts, traffic offenses, child support, and criminal defense. He serves on the board of Ashe Allegheny Home Builders Association, previously served on the boards of the Ashe County Chamber of Commerce, the Ashe County Free Medical Clinic, the Ashe County Board of Realtors. The most important thing about Jonathan is that when I was the president of the John Locke Foundation, he was our first director of research. So he worked at Locke back in the 90s. Somehow he overcame that disadvantage and went on to flourish. So at that point, let's turn it over to Mike.
And I'm sitting here on the far right, so I feel comfortable here. But anyway, fantastic to be here. I've been asked to talk about sort of the perspective of a faculty member dealing with the issue of social justice on college campuses. This is something that actually affects me very directly, and it most recently affected me this morning as I got up and had to fill out a letter of recommendation to one of my students, great student who had majored in psychology, actually. She had taken a couple of courses under me in the Criminology program. I teach law of evidence, and I also teach criminal procedure. She took both of those courses, great student, and decided she didn't want to pursue psychology, but instead wanted to pursue a master in social work at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And so she decided to come to me for a letter of recommendation. And I'm accustomed to filling out these forms. Basically, I have to upload an actual letter, but I have to go through and check boxes and answer questions. And usually I'm given the opportunity to opt out of answering a question. I can always choose the option, no basis for observation. For example, if the question is asked, what are the students' oral presentation skills, and maybe it's a class where they didn't have to do an oral report, I could always check that box, no basis for observation. One of the questions, actually it was a statement, and I was asked to respond anywhere from strongly agree to strongly disagree. One of the statements was, the applicant is committed to social justice and diversity. Think about that for a moment, how serious that is. First of all, I have no basis whatsoever for judgment. When I teach evidence law in the Federal Rules of Evidence, politics don't come up at all under any circumstances, and I have no opportunity and no desire to judge the politics of my students in the classroom. But I am actually being forced to say that this is a person who is on board with the social justice movement in order to get that person through the application process. Because you better believe if I were to answer in the middle or strongly disagree with that, that would be the end of that student's application to the program. So obviously we are in a position where the social justice movement is now demanding that we grade our students based upon their politics effectively, that we evaluate them in that manner. And I think it's very worthwhile for us to stop and ask how we got to this point. And I think most people that I interact with, they're surprised, of course, that a conservative is a college professor. That's a very long story. I wasn't when I got started, and basically that's why they love me very much and why we ended up in litigation later on. But for quite some time. It's really interesting because they say, gosh, how can you survive working with Marxists all the time? And we do have, I think, an assumption that the social justice movement is just something that kind of naturally flows out of a Marxist worldview, right? Doesn't that make sense? I mean, what it's really all about is redistribution. Now, I am extremely annoyed by my Marxist colleagues. I mean, these people run around and they talk about, having revolutions. They don't own guns, so they're just kind of entertaining and they're annoying. But the people that I work with in my department that actually really annoy me and actually scare me a little bit more are actually the postmodernists. And I have plenty of colleagues who are postmodernists, who are truth deniers. And I think we need to talk for just a second about how that worldview has contributed to the current crisis with regard to social justice. It has put in place certain policies that are very dangerous to academic life. First of all, I mean, what could be more dangerous than that? The postmodernist, a person who runs around in higher education and puts scare quotes around the word truth. They actually reject the idea of objective truth, and they think that what we call truth is simply a function of a power struggle between different groups. And just one dominant group has emerged, and they have allowed their narrative to dominate. That's disturbing, because what the hell is the point of having a university if we don't think that the pursuit of truth is possible because truth actually doesn't exist? That's incredibly dangerous. And it really has produced some very serious campus-wide problems. I guess I might get into this a little bit later, but I have abandoned doing research in my own field, and I've started now to write articles criticizing higher education. That's all I've done since I won my lawsuit. I've had a little bit more freedom to do that. But I've actually been tackling a couple of different issues. The first issue, I wrote about this in a Academic Questions article in 2017. We talked about the issue of campus speech codes, and that is my number one problem with the university system, is the assaults on free speech. But the other thing I've written about more recently in, Federalist Society Review, I co-authored an article with Casey Johnson when we were talking about the issue of due process on college campuses, and specifically the need for us to have right to counsel legislation. These are two issues that have been very important to me, and I hope we can understand how the lack of due process and lack of free speech on college campuses has been a serious issue that's kind of been driven by a postmodern worldview that's kind of morphed into this social justice mission. I mean, stop and think about it for just a moment. It isn't possible for us to have speech codes that actually eliminate all offensive speech, because all speech is offensive to someone. It isn't possible for us to fully eliminate offensive speech unless we fully eliminate dialogue. So what happens in day-to-day life on the college campus is that we are involved in the selective enforcement of campus speech codes. And how do we make a determination as to when we are going to crack down on someone for engaging in offensive speech? We look at demographics, and we ask ourselves, what group was the individual in who was offended by speech? And if that person is a racial minority, if the person is a feminist, if a person is a member of the LGBT community, and heaven forbid they were offended by someone with white privilege, what do? That's when the university steps in. And the purpose in doing that is to what? Make sure that this dominant narrative out there from people who have white privilege is kind of taken down a notch, and that these other narratives, see how that's postmodernism, these other narratives from disenfranchised groups somehow emerge, not through a free and open marketplace of ideas, but by the university kind of tipping the scales in the whole process of free speech. And you can see how this is wholly consistent with the idea of social justice and the idea that individuals don't have rights, but groups have rights. And that is antithetical to the entire American experiment. And it is exactly the same way that we should analyze the current problem with campus due process. All of a sudden, in the last 4 years of the Obama administration, we see a 49% increase in sexual assault on college campuses. How is that possible if sexual assault, like every other predatory crime, has been declining for over a quarter of a century steadily since about 1992, by the way? How is that possible? Well, we've changed our reporting procedures on campus, haven't we? And we have created this false epidemic out there. Why? Okay? Well, we've created the problem so that we can now come along with the solution. The solution is what? Now that we have this epidemic, we need to do something about it. Heather addressed this a little bit, the issue of due process on college campuses. They have decided that we need to erode the presumption of innocence, the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, the protection of double jeopardy. Why? Because now the purpose of the campus judiciary is not to find the truth. Remember, truth doesn't exist. It's to be used in scare quotes. It is to promote a narrative from a disenfranchised group on college campuses, namely women. So what if a few innocent men are convicted in the process? We are engaged in a leveling process in which we're engaged in a war on white privilege, essentially, okay? A white male privilege, I should say, in this context. It is very disturbing because obviously, this philosophy has greatly disrupted campus life. The erosion of due process, and more importantly, I think the erosion of free speech, has really undermined the very idea of what the university's purpose should be. Now, I haven't given you much in the way of optimism, and I heard it said before that we were supposed to be on this panel talking about what can be done about that. We actually have done some things in North Carolina that have been very positive. We have gotten involved in HB 527, obviously, and gotten past a very comprehensive free speech bill in the state of North Carolina, which has substantially eviscerated speech codes and speech zones on college campuses. And it has caused North Carolina now to be one of the states that has the most green light schools. I assume that people know what green light means. If you don't, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education awards universities that have no unconstitutional speech codes violating free speech with a green light rating. Sadly, there are only 50 of those universities in the entire United States of America. but the state of North Carolina is one of the ones with the most. Arizona is another one, and now Mississippi. Both of those states, by the way, all of their major institutions now actually have green lights, and we are really in an elite position here in terms of, I guess, now the health of our universities in terms of their actual written policies. And we have been able to achieve that through a process of using the legislature. We also have been able to achieve something with regard to the issue of due process as well. I am very pleased that the state of North Carolina is the very first one in the union to ever pass a Right to Counsel Act to say that under no circumstances can a student be expelled or suspended from a university in a hearing where they face the counsel from the university without also having their own right to counsel. And so, sort of the effects of the postmodern-driven social justice movement have been very negative with regard to the campus-wide community, but we have managed to use the legislature to fight back to a degree, and there's a lesson in that. We have to have that relationship between right-thinking faculty members and the legislature, and we have to use them as a tool for fighting back because the problems that we have are so incredibly deep. I did want to mention, though, how these notions of social justice have very negatively impacted my specific discipline of criminology. I work in a criminology department. We are together with sociology, and the movement has wildly impacted the quality of research and the quality of teaching within that discipline. One of the reasons why I no longer do academic research within my own discipline is that a number of years ago, I published many referee journal articles dealing with the issue of crime causation. And I would have very large samples in which I would study the effects of peer pressure and modeling and various social learning variables upon drug use, alcohol use, predatory criminality. And I noticed very early on in my career, which began in the 1990s, that I was not allowed to do research on an individual level. That the reviewers, the peer reviewers, began very early demanding that I disaggregate the data and that I run models separately for blacks, whites, males, females, lower class individuals versus middle class individuals, because ultimately we were all being forced to be social justice warriors. Do you see that? Instead of dealing with subjects as individuals, it was demanded that we start addressing certain demographic variables. Loops right back around to postmodernism, the idea that there isn't just one theory out there. There should be separate theories for blacks and whites and poor people and middle-class people because there are separate realities and separate truths out there. And that became very annoying for me. And I'm very thankful, by the way, that there are research outlets there like Academic Questions where I can publish scholarly responses to some of this nonsense. We recently, I think, published an article in Academic Questions on queer criminology. I don't have time to talk about that new movement within criminology, but we are becoming quite irrelevant. And in terms of not only our research, but this whole movement towards social justice has also been very damaging on the teaching in my department and the academic experience that students have. I was approached by a student just a few weeks ago who was incredibly frustrated that his professor was still talking about the John Kavanaugh hearings well over a year after the whole matter has been settled. And she was absolutely insisting that there was more than enough evidence to suggest that he was guilty of sexual assault. The problem is that the week before that, she was talking about the O.J. Simpson case and said that there clearly was not enough evidence to convict him in that particular case. And, the student asked the question, what do you think about that? The professor happens to be a black female, and the student asked me whether his professor was just perhaps a racist. I said, well, no, you're likely to get a similar lecture from a white female as well. And here's the reason for that. We are no longer concerned, even in criminology and criminal justice departments, with the truth of individual verdicts. We are interested in the larger demographic narrative. And the whole point of the lecture was to what? Wage a war against John Kavanaugh because he is a representative of white privilege, and to side with Simpson in that case, not because the facts were on his side, but doing so tells about the black experience in the criminal justice system. So obviously, it is destroying the classroom experience for students. It is destroying the research experience for faculty members. And so it's something that we need to start talking about and thinking about how we're going to remedy. And I would suggest the first thing we need to do is to understand the root philosophical causes. I hope I've helped in that regard. So,
I'm speaking simply as a member of a governing board. I'm not an academic, but as part of a governing board, I have had occasion to interact with academics, and particularly in a couple of instances, in the university, I think many of you know, you can have things called academic centers, which are formed by, there's tended to be cross-departmental, interdepartmental academic units that are really focused on research, intended on research. But there were at UNC Law School a couple of centers that were not focused really on research, but on politics. They were really partisan political centers. And one was a poverty center and a law school. Go figure that. And then what they called a civil rights center, which I think really was not a civil rights center, but a partisan political center. And they would represent Moral Monday protesters. I don't know if you're familiar with Moral Monday, but it's an anti-Republican protest movement. But they would do things like that, and they never won a case on the merits, and so it was used by very liberal political activists to promote their philosophy, and social justice was one of them in the university. And so the Board of Governors does set the policy for these academic centers, and we determined that in the case of the Poverty Center, it should be terminated, and that in the case of the Civil Rights Center, it should not be allowed to sue other parties, cities and counties. And the state bar later on affirmed that it was not, you can't have a law firm in a university, so therefore it was not authorized to practice law. But during the course of the discussion, there were many people who were opposed to what we did, and they said we were stepping on academic freedom. And so I became interested in the Statement of Academic Freedom from 1940, and I actually found a lot of comfort in it because I found things I didn't expect. Just to read a couple of excerpts. Teachers are entitled to freedom in the classroom in discussing their subject, but they should be careful not to introduce into their teaching controversial matter which has no relation to their subject. And that's in the Statement of Academic Freedom. And also there's responsibility that's imposed on academics. That says that college and university teachers are citizens, they're members of a learned profession and officers of an educational institution. When they speak or write as citizens, they should be free from institutional censorship and discipline, but their special position in the community imposes special obligations. As scholars and educational officers, they should remember that the public may judge their profession and their institution by their utterances. Hence, they should at all times be accurate, should exercise appropriate restraint, should show respect for the opinions of others, and should make every effort to indicate that they are not speaking for the institution. And in many instances, I saw that was being violated at UNC Law School. That was one department I dealt with. And, to give you so what someone has described UNC Law School faculty to me as is this: if it were a football team, you'd have 11 players devoted to civil rights and 1 to business law. And, sure enough, I went and looked at the profile of the professors, and it was that case. In my law firm, we had clerks from UNC, and they said, they can find all the civil rights courses they want, but it's tough sometimes to get into the business courses. Now, I know the current dean is trying to change that. They've had 3 ideologically very leftist deans for many, many years. And so the whole faculty's basically gone from being a school, I call it a club. It's really a club. But I think the viewpoint diversity is a big problem in the university. I think most of what happens in the university is good. Our kids are getting, good educations for good jobs. But there are problems of cost, I think, too many buildings, and I think viewpoint diversity is one. And it's very frustrating to me on how to fix it, but I've come to the conclusion that it's a structural problem. Because just to give you an example of what was described to me, in order to get a job at UNC Law School on the faculty, there's a committee that the dean will appoint to hire the person, but the candidate has to go around and meet all the other faculty. And then they'll have a big faculty meeting to talk about the candidate. Well, they'll never hire a conservative because they don't want anybody in the club. And I have come to believe that we need to centralize the management of academic institutions so that if you don't have viewpoint diversity, you can go talk to the leader or group of leaders and say, you have a problem here. You need to bring in different points of view. And I've come to that. I don't know if that's actually the solution, but I think it should be considered and thought through.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Jonathan Jordan, and as John Hood mentioned, one of my first jobs out of school was at the Locke Foundation as their first director of research. And that was before you had to have a PhD to even apply for the job. So I feel very honored that I actually got that job with the terminal graduate degrees I have and no PhD. And I remember, John, you called us lawyers cartel, remember?
I stand by that.
I'm sure you do. So what I thought was interesting in the first talks today was how many of my alma maters are targets of these things, Wake Forest, Carolina. And I heard that Tennessee was involved, so I wonder if they have Vanderbilt as well, which is also another school. So they probably are. But Appalachian State University is in my backyard, and I represented it when I was a member of the State House, House District 93, which was Ashe and Watauga counties. We're in the far northwest corner of the state. So we're called the Lost Provinces. We're ignored by Raleigh very often, but not when I was down there, I'll tell you what. And my folks appreciated that. I think I'm here because I'm probably, and I'll take a wild guess, I may be the only actual politician here. Are there any other elected officials or politicians or former elected officials? See, I was right, yeah. So I went to the dark side after the Locke Foundation, went into politics.
Somebody's got to do it.
Somebody, yes. So did private practice of law, though, of course, and then while I was in the legislature as well. But they asked me to come here and talk specifically about the House Bill 527, which you heard Mike talk about. And it involved the Board of Governors. It set up some things that the Board of Governors had to do. So we're kind of worming our way down. We're now down to the bill itself, and I worked on the bill itself with the help of lots of people, but it was very important to me. The reason being, Appalachian State University is in my backyard. And they had one of these, you already heard from Mike, a free speech zone. And actually, the real name of it is an unscheduled public speaking area. I kid you not. It's an unscheduled public speaking area. That's what they were called. But they were free speech zones several years ago. And some student friends of mine on campus did a letter to the paper, and they looked at it. And the free speech zones at Appalachian comprise 0.67% of the campus property. About 2/3% of the whole campus property. Now, when I went to college, and maybe when a lot of you did as well, I thought a university was a free speech zone. I thought the whole place, was free speech. You could talk about ideas and things. But Appalachian decided, no, we want it just here. 0.67%, 2/3% of 1%. And that's where you could chalk and debate and talk and so forth, and that was all. Well, that's obviously ridiculous. And that's what we decided we needed to go after with the Campus Free Speech Bill, House Bill 527. The Lieutenant Governor, Dan Forrest, his office was very involved with this. There were people in the Senate. See, when you do legislation, you've got to have partners in the House and Senate to get it all through, to get it voted on, everything. You can't do something by yourself. You need help. And I know the gentleman that was asking questions earlier this morning about what can we do politically, I knew I would probably end up getting those questions, so I wanted to kind of head off maybe some of those questions. If you want to talk to the legislators, I would recommend, first of all, you start with the legislator for your state house district, wherever you are. So look up ncleg.gov, the legislative website, and find out who represents you in the state house and state senate, because you need both. But there are some committees that you might want to pay attention to if you're really interested in these issues. On the House side, you've got two different kinds of things. You've got the public policy side. There's a House Education Universities. That does public policy. But there's also House Appropriations, which does the money for education and higher education. And I would talk to those chairs. There's 2 chairs on the policy side. There's 5 chairs on the finance side. In the Senate, same kind of thing. You've got a committee on education, higher education, public policy issues. And one of it is my state senator, so I'm very proud to have that. And then on the appropriations side, in the Senate, education, higher education, they have 3 chairs. So start with those folks. If you're interested in the political side of it, getting things done on the legislative side, that's probably where you're going to need to start. So to get something like House Bill 527, which is Restore, Preserve Campus Free Speech, that was the actual name of it. That was came out of some national plans that you may have seen. And they came and met with us and the lieutenant governor and his council. And I worked with another legislator who left the legislature shortly after we started working on this. But it set up a policy, basically. And in fact, I'll read right here from the legislative staff. No prior law, no statutes addressed free speech at the constituent institutions of the University of North Carolina. The Board of Governors had adopted a broad policy that, quote, supports and encourages freedom of inquiry for faculty members and students, protects faculty and students in their responsible exercise of the freedom to teach, to learn, and otherwise seek and speak the truth. So the Board of Governors had already done a very broad policy, but there wasn't any law in place. And so that's what we worked on getting done, was just to help set up so the Board of Governors would set it up so that faculty and administration, mostly administration, could not force students and faculty to take positions on public policy issues, which is great. Don't get them involved. They shouldn't be enforcing. Talk about a power struggle. Talk about a power differential. The administration of the university versus their faculty versus their students. So that's what we put in place. And when you get to the question part, we can ask Steve about how it got actually executed. He was chairman of the first committee that was designed by this statute to be set up to look at a policy for the universities. So I kind of think I'm here to talk about that as well, but I also have my own experiences. I went to several different schools in North Carolina and faced, because I'm a very political person, obviously, as you could tell from the things from John. I faced a lot of those, even back when I was going to college, the things going on campus. The difference was this. You hear now today, and even a few years ago, about speakers like Tom Tancredo and Ann Coulter, Ben Shapiro being driven off campus when they've come to speak, because all student groups at campuses typically have the right to invite speakers to come because we want to educate everybody. But it seems like the conservative speakers are the ones that get attacked and driven off campus and even booed, as opposed to a conversation back and forth with the ideas. Well, even when I was in school, a speaker came to campus, and there were liberal protesters there, but what they did was they took over the middle section of the 3-section auditorium, and when the speaker came up, they stood up and put their back to the speaker the whole time. That is perfectly fine with me. I don't know what you say. That is perfectly fine with me. I don't care if you want to come and show in a non-disruptive way. See how that was non-disruptive? They weren't hollering, they weren't yelling, there weren't signs. They stood up and very quietly faced the other way. I was kind of impressed with that. I mean, I didn't agree with them one bit, but that was a kind of a good way. If you're going to actively show your disagreement, well, that's a fine way. It didn't prevent the speaker, who was from the Contras. Remember in Nicaragua, the Contras? It was one of their leaders. So that was really good. But now, fast forward today, and what do we see? That's not good enough anymore. Now they have to chant, disrupt the entire thing, chase the person off campus or out of the building, and that is absolutely unacceptable. And we need to fight that every possible way that we can. And this was one little way, this bill, to help set up some policies for our universities. And it wasn't just me. It was a whole legislation. Takes a lot of cooks. There's a lot of cooks for that recipe. But I'm very proud to be part of that, because I think that being executed by the Board of Governors led to us having so many green light schools versus the yellow and red light schools that we had before. And even Appalachian, even though their new chancellor, she is pretty liberal. But I met with her when she first got here, and she made some good comments about the speech zones, that we shouldn't protect students from speech, that they need to engage in speech. And the answer to one kind of speech is other opposing kinds of speech. And I appreciated that. So even though we're not on the same political side, she made a very good point. And believe it or not, one of the things I used in debating this bill was the fact that the Appalachian State University faculty had a policy in place from their faculty senate that covered the University of Chicago, I think, was one of that explained all of that. And our faculty actually, for the most part, was in support of free speech, which I was impressed with very much. Even though we have other examples, like there's a video of one of the professors talking to his class about the General Assembly and the Republican majority down there and what they had done. and quite a profane-laden rant about you should vote against these jerks and you should do this and that during class. Now, what student is going to say anything about that? Who's going to stay? Oh, that's not right, professor. Come on. We were all in school. How many of you would stand up against your professors? They're going to write letters of recommendation for you or not. So stuff like that's still going on with individuals. But for the most part, I was very impressed. The faculty stood up for free speech. The chancellor did. And now Appalachian's a green light school. So, you know, they're not perfect, but they made the right choices. And I'm very glad to have represented them with that. And I'll be glad to answer any questions at this point. I'll kind of hand it back. Thank you.
All right, so I've got a couple of questions I want to pose just from what y'all have talked about, and you've all at various points referenced legislative action, action by the Board of Governors, organizations that are engaged in either financing or governing state university systems. So I have a general question I'll ask in a second, but let's talk about the free speech law a little bit more. Of course, not everybody liked it, shockingly. One of the arguments made by the critics was this law restricts free speech because it prevents protesters from expressing themselves. And that while the Republicans said they were for free speech, they were actually trying to control free expression on campus. I can't deliver it any more creatively and effectively than that, but that was the objection. What's the answer?
No, that's just the right one. I think what you're talking about is that it may inhibit the heckler. Mm-hmm. And, there's a thing in the free speech world about the heckler's veto, that if you can't, you have a speaker, but if there's a group in there that's going to heckle them, then they win, and they have shut down the speech. I don't think that a policy that protects the heckler is what we ought to be concerned about. There's plenty of opportunities for people to have speech presented to the student body, but when somebody comes to campus, whoever it is, liberal, conservative, moderate, whatever, they ought to be allowed to speak. We ought to have civil discourse, and we ought to treat people respectfully. And I think that's consistent with this statement of academic freedom. I think that's what we teach our students when we punish the heckler, which I think we should.
Yeah, we had two criticisms, basically, that I remember. I worked closely with Chris Millis on this, and there were two problems that we had. All of them were coming from Democrats. It was fascinating. And one of them was that it was a regulation. So I thought that was interesting. Here you have one bill that wipes out all of the speech codes and all of the speech zones. It's like one law that gets rid of a bunch. And obviously, it was a net gain for deregulation, so that was kind of absurd. But the other one we got quite frequently was there were some specifics, as I recall, in the bill that came from the Goldwater Institute that were very specific. It was based on a white paper, and they were very specific about what ought to be done to protesters who disrupt. I didn't have any problem with that particular language because it seemed to be a codification of Gregory versus Chicago from 1969. It was just repeating what the Supreme Court said, that the heckler doesn't have a right. You don't have a free speech right to drown out the free speech of other people. But I believe we changed that language to basically say that we're not going to go in and mandate the solution that was coming from the Goldwater Institute. But didn't we say, I think, simply to tell the institutions that they had to come up with something that would keep people from imposing a heckler's veto.
Right. The biggest difficulty in implementing that law was, or the biggest criticism was when the original draft was presented. Right. And yours truly got the original draft from the University of Wisconsin. I think they're the only ones that had done a speech policy, but it called for penalties against people who disrupted speech, which I didn't see any problem with that. But there were a lot of people, particularly in the faculty, who did not want a penalty, for various reasons. They said, for example, the system office should not tell each particular campus what penalty to impose, or to impose a penalty at all. And, I have found a lot of pushback in academia for something which I think is, in the private sector would be accepted, is that whenever you break the rules, there should be some consequences. But in the free speech policy, there was a lot of pushback on that. So it was watered down, And I think now that they have to consider penalties, including expulsion if it becomes a repeated occurrence.
So let me talk a little bit just to respond to that about the political side, since that's why I'm here. Remember, I'm the only politician. So there was an original edition, and then there were 4 editions of this bill. I mean, this bill went through committees in the House and the Senate. Outside folks looked at it and worked with us. We worked closely with the general administration of the university system to work with things. There was a version that was ratified, so that is 6, and then it became a session law. Now, what is interesting here is this bill, even though it passed the House, the final version, 80 to 32 in the House. So that means there were Democrats voting with us as well. It passed the Senate 34 to 11. So again, Democrats are involved. The governor did not sign it. It became law without his signature. It's one of those bills where the governor can hold it for 10 days if we're in session. And if he doesn't sign it, it becomes law without his signature. He chose for free speech on campus to be something become a law without his signature. And I can't wait for the lieutenant governor to bring this up against his campaign against the governor, but I won't make this political. But that will be a very interesting question. It'll have to be discussed. Now, when I went back to my alma mater, UNC Law School, you went there too, didn't you? No. Okay, but you know all my, I see, okay. So when I went back to talk about this issue with a faculty panel, they were basically good. Lawyers like to analyze things, but one did come up with the term, I think it was, is it counter speech? What is the term? They were saying this bill prevented counter speech, which is the other folk. How they got to that, I don't know, but they were really pleased that it prevents counter speech. And I think it was talking about the penalties. That may have been what they were really aiming at. So we took care of that. It does not regulate free speech. And going to Carolina to talk about the faculty, since I actually went there, there was one, and I'll give you the numbers. These are real. These are not made up. One of the faculty members was a registered Republican. I knew he was the head of our he was the faculty sponsor for the Lincoln group, the Lincoln Law Group. One was a kind of a paleo-conservative Democrat, so real crusty, old-time conservative Democrat. One was sort of a Kennedy-esque kind of positive, middle-of-the-road Democrat professor. Great. There were 70 that were not in those categories. Left-wing liberal. And I'm not kidding you. You can look those numbers up. That's when I was going there.
Well, that leads to my next question. So we've been talking about legislative solutions. Mike, you mentioned a couple of them, a couple of policy changes that made an improvement. Some would argue, though, that there's a pretty clear limit to how much legislation can get at the roots of the problem, because it involves, as speakers have said earlier today, the composition of the faculty, the entire market in higher education, which has lots of private institutions for which legislation is either irrelevant or limited in its applicability. So is there a danger of thinking that too much of this can be addressed by getting the right politicians, or even Jonathan, getting politicians to figure out this is a problem and pass a law, when there's a broader cultural difficulty here that cannot be got at with legislative or political action?
Yeah, I've actually noticed a very recent change. I can't explain this one, but suddenly, I guess it was around the semester, it probably was the fall of 2015 when we had both the Mizzou and the Yale controversies. I've noticed we're in a situation culturally where we've won all these legal battles, but it's like we've lost the cultural war, and we pass these great bills that the students ought to be really excited about, and we show the bills to them and say, look, we've given you your free speech rights back, and they say, no, thank you, we don't want them. I mean, I say this a lot in my speeches on college campuses. I say you have a choice between being comfortable and being free, and you can't be both. And increasingly, the students have chosen to be comfortable instead of being free. But that doesn't mean that we need to stop passing the legislation, because the fact of the matter is that the policies that we've codified on college campuses that we're now getting rid of have changed the culture, basically. I mean, I know whenever I say something controversial on Twitter, like daily, The students are always, well, he violated the Seahawk Respect Compact. Well, guess what? That's non-enforceable because it's not constitutional, because it bans all disrespectful speech, but it doesn't define it. You see how the culture, they read the policies at the university, and they are told and they believe that they have a constitutional right to feel comfortable somehow, so they really do believe that. They really do believe that. And the fact of the matter is, we do have to change the culture, but the first thing that we have to do, is we have to get rid of those policies. We have to. It's a two-step process.
And you're absolutely right. The legislators are not our catch-all to fix everything for us. Please don't believe that. Just passing a law is not going to do it. As an attorney, I also believe in all the stuff that Mike's been telling you about the advocacy and presenting evidence and double jeopardy, all of that. And it just strikes me to my soul when I see free speech not being allowed. They're doing other things. And I had a debate in my last my last state house election. It was a town hall kind of thing in front of the students at our local middle school. And those students had some great questions for us. So we had in advance, but they wanted to know things about the NFL players who were not saluting the flag and things like that. And we had a good discussion on that. My opponent and I, we had some real good information for the kids. But I told them about how free speech is one of the rights protected in our Constitution's First Amendment. So I told them it means we all have the right to say what we believe with very few restrictions. For example, you cannot cry fire in a dark, crowded theater because of the chaos and danger that you could create in that situation. But it also extends to various actions, not just speech. And I said, both sides have the rights to say and do what they believe. And that's kind of the basis of our Constitution, and we need to stick with that. Both sides have a point, and we got to protect everyone's right to say it because we can learn from each other. And the kids seem to understand that. I'm not sure why the millennials don't, why some of the college students don't either. But and again, here's another way we can't just pass a law and be done. And I don't want to be too controversial, but look what happened with the Silent Sam statue at Carolina. There was a process already in place for how this was being dealt with and was going to be dealt with. As an attorney, I'm like, that's great. I was trained here at Carolina. That should be done. The process, let's see what happens. And a mob comes in, tears it down because they don't like it, and the university basically completely avoided their responsibility in the whole thing. And I'm so ashamed of the administration for doing that. But there was a law in place. There was a process in place. And Henry Henry VI, when that guy Dick the Butcher says the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. You remember that? I've taught my son. He is 14 years old now. I've taught my son what that means is that mob rule group wanted to get rid of all the attorneys, the judges, the people who would stand in their way of removing a society that had rule of law, not the rule of man. That's why they wanted to kill the lawyers. They were going to stop the mob rule crazy stuff. So even with laws in place, we can't depend on them because things are going to happen. So we've got to find other ways to do it too. So,
John, I think that legislation is not going to solve the problem because I believe that I think, first of all, there are a lot of faculty who agree there needs to be a diversity of viewpoints in the university. The university is always best when you have the liberal, conservative, in various degrees debating. I think that's more interesting. I think it allows the student a better range of viewpoints to make their own decision. I think even social justice should be allowed and heard in the university so the students can make their own mind. The problem, I think, is the structure, and I get back to the structure. I think a more centralized management would help us. I mean, it's something that should be considered. But you're not going to get it by getting a new board of governors or a new chancellor or another. There's a systemic problem. And just one example. There was a group of liberal professors that were going to do a forum, and they needed a conservative professor. They couldn't find one in Chapel Hill, so they finally found an adjunct. And the adjunct said, "Yeah, I'll do it," but isn't it pretty pitiful that you have to ask an adjunct to bring diversity to your viewpoints? I mean, there's a systemic problem inside the university. It's not on your governing boards. It's not at the chancellor level. It's inside the university. And until we deal with that problem, it's not going to happen. And let me just say on the thing about punishment for wrongdoing, I am surprised at the amount of pushback you get on that. Because if I violate a rule at work, there'll be consequences. But that's not done at the university. I had one representative of the American Association of University professors say to me, well, you may be able to pass a policy that says there needs to be consequences, but the faculty have to approve it because it might infringe on academic freedom. And if I just read it, the freedom is in the university, in the classroom. But when you're violating rules like destroying property and that sort of thing, I don't think the academic is infringed at that point.
So, Steve, you keep setting up the next question, and I have one more question, and then we'll come to the audience, and it's specifically on the question of academic freedom. We know that lots of the differences, political differences between progressives and conservatives, or different ways you can use the terms, have to do with how terms are defined, how people understand words like freedom and justice. If you understand them differently, not only are you going to disagree, but you may have a hard time debating it because you're not even speaking the same language. So, for example, with academic freedom, you've just suggested a couple of times that the faculty has too much control over who gets hired, or even, to broaden the point a bit, what kinds of programming happens within a department. Sometimes faculty the argument is, from some who view academic freedom as a collective sort of concept, that the faculty as a whole is going to be in charge of this, that, and the other, which means, in fact, in practice, restraining some individual professors or not hiring individual professors on the basis of things that are extraneous. Others would define academic freedom as an individual concept, and that in some kind of change in the hiring process so that there is centralization, or maybe a different way to put it would be the faculty does not vote on or say who is going to be hired within a department. That's the job of the person running the department or the school. That would be a defense of academic freedom, but others would argue that's an encroachment of academic freedom. So you've argued this, we should change the way we hire professors. I wonder what Mike and Jonathan have to say about that idea.
I think that what Steve has described is something we should certainly consider. I've been a consumer of university education, but I've not been a purveyor of it except for a few courses here and there that I have actually taught at universities, but just a few. If that's what's going on, if you're saying that a new person is kind of paraded through the whole department, clearly you're going to get someone who fits in with that club, and they're not going to be different, and they're not going to argue with those people, or they're going to hide it, and that's not what somebody want either. So, absolutely, I've never thought of the structure being changed. I don't think that affects academic freedom, because what have you got right now is the same group. They all think the same anyway, so how can you possibly make that worse? Putting in new ideas, bringing in new people, some other way to get them hired, has got to improve the situation. I don't see how it could get worse. That's sort of how I would see it.
Yeah, I don't know how specifically, I don't have any ideas for specifically changing the hiring process to promote viewpoint diversity, because it's very interesting. I came to the University of North Carolina at Wilmington as a political leftist and an atheist. And they just said things in hiring meetings about, we can't hire this person because they went to Catholic University. Oh, that person went to West Point, therefore they're too conservative. They just used to say things in front of me like that when I was a member of the club. I converted later on. Then things got tremendously interesting because I got a column at Town Hall. I just decided to start publishing their remarks, attached to their names. I started doing that. So what do you think the effect of that was? They stopped saying the things, but they spend so much time in the process of looking through the Vita and going through the process of having dinner with them and interacting. They know fully what their religious views and political views are as well. And what it's really changed is that they use code words, essentially, in actual department meetings where we're making those decisions. So that's very difficult to deal with. The hiring process aspect, very difficult.
Let me just say, I realize that that's the case, and it may not work. That's something to consider. But one thing to remember, I think the university is at its best when it interacts with society. And in the engineering program, they're working with the engineering firms. In the computer science program, they're working with the computer scientists and learning what's relevant in the industry. But in the humanities, not so much. And it's just, I think, an interaction with people in the society that in the engineering world and the computer world, they bring to the academics the current things, what's happening, what's important. Somehow, some way, I think we ought to interject that in the English departments, the political science departments, the law departments. I don't know how you do that. I do think, and I would be very comfortable if they were all Democrats who were not in the academy, who were just living in the real world. Because I think it gives a dose of the real world to the academics, kind of pierces the ivory tower, and brings some normalcy to the whole thing. Because now we've got some of these really crazy ideas floating around in the university, and there's nobody there to say, hey, that may be going a little too far. So I think we need to find some way, and it may be through the board of trustees, advisory boards, whatever, but we need to bring some interaction with the real world to our universities, because the statement of academic freedom says the university is for the common good. It's not for the faculty, and it's so that's an important thing that I think we should consider.
Let me turn it back on you just a minute. As a high muckety-muck in a foundation, do we need more conservative endowed professorships or liberty professorships or freedom professorships or something like that?
No comment.
Oh. Well, there we go.
Well, I was told earlier the day by a different speaker we shouldn't give any money to universities, so I'm not sure.
Professorship, not university.
Well, let me put it this way. The Pope Foundation does support various activities on campuses. They're always restricted grants, and they are not endowed. Never give your money away entirely. All right. So you had a question, then John. We'll come back around. Go ahead.
On the topic of free speech and kind of like legislative, it seems kind of ironic we're actually looking at state legislation of free speech where it's supposed to be a national idea,
right.
A federal idea, which is constitutionally allowed or deemed. That 27 went through. It is now state law, right? That was passed. When did that come? 2017. So in March 2019, Trump signed an executive order about free speech on college campus and funding. Do you have any comments about how we're looking at it now, like legislatively and actually, legally? I think it's just a federal thing anyway. What's your ideas on how it's starting to play out, where states now are kind of jumping in on it individually? It seems backwards.
Let me just say something about the need for state legislation. I am one who went through a 7.5-year federal lawsuit with my university, and I know that going through the federal court system takes a very long time sometimes. And so what we need is multiple layers and multiple avenues, basically. If you go to Minnesota, it's like it's so cold, one coat usually doesn't cut it, right? So you go with layers. I've got a jacket, I got a coat on the outside. That's the way I look at the free speech issue. We need multiple layers to deal with the problem. And also it helps with the issue of qualified immunity. Someone who is a dean who is suppressing the constitutional rights of a student can claim that they're not an expert in constitutional law. But if we have passed a state bill that mandates that the policies have to be taught during the orientation process, it's a hell of a lot more difficult to claim qualified immunity. So that's another reason why I strongly support state legislation.
And I call that belt and suspenders, not the layer coats. So.
Yeah, there you go.
And imagine Congress doing something anyway. I mean, your state legislature got it done.
Right.
John.
Oh, there's another aspect of it.
I was going to say, it seems like the states are going to have to now step up and individually say it, whereas we think of it as a national, federal, it's a federal idea anyway. Yeah. You know what I mean? We have to somehow restate what the Constitution already says for us. You know what I mean? The states are now having to fight that initial battle, which was already set forth way back when, in 2019, where we have to make that case again, because the hecklers are saying that, the definition isn't correct. That's all I want to say. It's kind of it seems backwards for me, that the states have to step up now where it's actually already been changed across the board.
Well, maybe, but the thing about it is if the states are the primary actors here, then errors may not be as pervasive. I would be worried about the federal government taking. I expect it would probably get screwed up, and then it would be the national policy. And at least if a state screws it up, some other state can get it right. So I understand what you're saying, but I'm more comfortable with state action here.
Patriot Act.
John.
Yeah, a couple of points. The Harvard motto is veritas, right? Truth. And, well, that's Harvard, maybe other places. But I think, in fact, the universe...
That's veritas in quotes now.
That's right. They're true.
Yeah, a dead white language, too. But anyway, the point is, it's not a joke. I mean, the university, in a way, is like a religion with one creed, and the one creed is truth. Because without truth, you have nothing. You have no possibility of anything. So, a group like some of these postmodernist types who say we don't believe in truth, the response should be bye-bye. You don't belong here. You just don't belong here. So that's one little point. But the other point was about these strange and bizarre disciplines like whiteness studies and mathematics of race and all this kind of nonsense. I remember years ago in the 19th century, there was only one kind of science. Everybody was just, the scientists were called natural philosophers. And then slowly there were attempts to subdivide. But I remember in the British Association, sorry, on British background, the British Association, people objected. Well, no, we shouldn't subdivide like that. And they went to like 3 different divisions of the whole of science, right? Now, the American Psychological Association has, you count them, I think 54 divisions. So each of these divisions have little circles, which are sort of not circular firing squads, circular massage squads. Say nice things to you. Look, it's a refereed publication. It's referee peer reviewed. You know, you get these little bubbles that are just divorced from any reality because of this subdivision. And I think the same phenomenon happens with hiring and all the curriculum design, all these things. That each little division lives in particularly in the softer sciences, I mean engineering, anything connected with the real world, you know, quite right, they're protected from this, and the hard sciences. But the social sciences, parts of biomedicine and so on, have been absolutely degraded in this way. And I think one way to prevent that is to have, for example, doctoral candidates, new appointments, the committees that judge them not drawn just from one department, not drawn from one department, but from the whole range of disciplines.
Yeah.
I just want to get your guys' reaction to that.
Amen on that. I would love to throw a few of my colleagues, scare quotes, in my department off the committees and get folks from chemistry, business, and yes, I would love that. Yeah, just one or two.
Or what about some membership of people who aren't on the faculty?
It could be a possibility too, particularly the humanities, people journalists, people who write and so on and so on. Yeah, I see growth in the whole thing. I mean,
When we do legislative committees and set up legislation to appoint boards to regulate things, there's not a public member, there's people from the profession, yeah, why not? The academia is too good for that, maybe?
Well, let me just say on that, the accreditation body does require that the academics have control over the academy, and I believe that the academics should have control over the academy. I do believe that. But I do think there is room for other voices, and I don't know how to do that and still maintain the accrediting standard, but I think it would benefit the university. I think it would benefit academics. And that's what I think we need to somehow start focusing more and more on the internal governance of the institution.
That prompts another question, though, Steve. Who elected the accreditation agencies?
Well, our accreditor is in Atlanta, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, SACS. And I know they're authorized through the Higher Education Act. And so, that would have to come really out of a federal legislation.
Thank you for the excellent panel. I would just take brief exception, and this is purely sort of a abstruse debate, Steve, with your suggestion that we need more relevance in the humanities. We need more outreach towards contemporary reality and make it more infused by an awareness of what's going on today. I would argue just the opposite. I think that students are going to get reality for the rest of their lives, and that these are 4 precious, incredibly inadequate years to lose yourself in something rare that you are not going to get in the rest of your life, which is the classical tradition. Obviously, in some fields that's less relevant, but I can tell you that there is already going on in the humanities and across the non-STEM fields this mania for interdisciplinary studies, because people are getting bored with their own discipline, and so they want to do something cutting edge and new, and so it inevitably is bringing in issues to try and be relevant in the humanities by doing, neuropsychology or whatnot. All of this is an excuse not to read those books, not to engage with Ben Jonson, not to engage with Aeschylus and the terror of the Oresteia and these Greek the festivals that presented these plays. This is what students should get. So I would just think twice before you advocate to the universities. You got to be more relevant, because that's been happening for a long time, and it serves only as an excuse for them to step aside their primary responsibility, which is to cram as much knowledge into the empty noggins of these students as is possible within 4 brief years before they go out, and then they will get, homeless policy and connections between, John Steinbeck maybe and current problems on the streets of San Francisco. So I have just a different vision of the university.
Hi, I just want to share this experience I had recently. It was right before Halloween. I went to a UNC class, Race and Memory, taught by Professor William Sturkey, and I was asked to be a guest speaker to advocate for free speech, to make the case. I was prepared for hostility. I was prepared for all the snapping and the laughing and whatnot. What I wasn't prepared for was the students' genuine, complete misunderstanding of the First Amendment and of the meaning of free speech. There was about 100 students in front of me, completely confused why the new free speech law applied to them. Because they said, after all, the Constitution and requirements of not disrupting the speech of others, that is only applicable to state and federal representatives or employees. So Chancellor, I guess she's gone, Chancellor Folk can't stop my free speech, but I can stop the free speech of you. So I just wanted to put that out there, that is, students are actually very convinced of this. And so there needs to be some sort of, we need to address the miseducation or the ignorance.
And it goes back to the lack of good civics education in high school. I got in an argument with a student who was talking about the hate speech clause exception within the First Amendment. I paused for a moment. He actually thought it was in the text, the exception to free speech for hate speech. He actually thought it was written into the text. Now, that's disturbing enough that he was a college student. It's more disturbing he attends Brown University, an Ivy League school. That's a true story. I just wanted to ruin your day with that anecdote.
We hand out copies
Steve.
of the Constitution from my office all the time, so just mail him one, I guess.
It's funny what you said, but it's not funny. I remember when I was defending the law that was passed, I had UNC professors and others, lawyers around the country, make this argument that the First Amendment, of course, is just a restraint on government action. So what does this have to do with protesters? This is not students. These were people who were professors. They didn't get it from the ether. They were taught that, of course, we know the First Amendment is a restriction on government suppression of free speech. That's quite literally what the amendment says. But that doesn't mean that you are authorized to violate the rights of other people. I was so puzzled by it, it sort of took me aback. It took me several days to realize they were really saying, of course we can bully people around. We don't work for the government. This was their argument.
Yes, well, the one this board is a prime example of critical analysis, and I think that despite the fact that we're been packed with a lot of facts and history, we don't teach history anymore, I'm sorry, packed with a lot of facts, what do we do with them without the critical analysis, which I think is the purpose of education? And if I'm going to vote, I have to know the difference between this side and that side. And could we also, somehow in the practice anyway, and certainly not the legislation, put quotes around salary?
Well, others have mentioned this today, but I'll just say real quick. My experience is that there are quite a few professors, not conservatives or libertarians, but people who are in the sort of mainstream of the politics on campus who really do believe in diversity, viewpoint diversity, teaching what they're supposed to teach. They have been silent, but maybe a little less silent recently. I've talked to a number of them. They become active. There have been campuses that have adopted the University of Chicago rules. Now, this is by no means, I'm not trying to slide into excessive optimism, but it is important to remember that this is not a fight that only people who are looking from the outside and who come from the right of the political spectrum care about. There are allies on campus, and they are interested in talking to us, and we should take them up on it.
That is true. One problem that concerns me is they're a little older.
They typically
You notice
are.
that it's typically
Yes.
the older professors, and now that's why when you said millennial, I said no, you're talking about Gen Zers, okay? Because now I work with millennial professors. Think about that. They're tenured millennials that I work with. We have to spend time together in department meetings, and their understanding of free speech is substantially below the few remaining Kennedy Democrats that we have on the faculty, and that's disturbing, of course.
Yes, sir.
I think any discussion of free speech in North Carolina has to have as a footnote, I think it was 63, 64, 65, somewhere in there. I was in high school at the time, and the legislature, which was solidly controlled by Democrats, and the governor was, I believe, Sanford or... Yeah. There was a speaker ban law in North Carolina, and it prohibited communists from speaking on campus. And there's a very famous picture of at Chapel Hill of I think it was Herbert Aptheker, or somebody was speaking
Standing on the other
side of the
brick
wall. Students were on one side and that kind of thing. And I'm not sure whatever happened to that law, but I think it's a bit bizarre. In our postmodern society, we have to have a speaker ban law, and you know, the postmodern ethos, as it is, of course, is that there's no ultimate truth except for the fact there's no ultimate truth. I mean, it's a self-contradictory phenomenon. And somebody said, you know, if somebody tells you there's no truth or that truth is relative, they're basically asking you not to believe them. So don't.
My brother's an only child.
Yeah.
So it's a bit weird, I think. You know, you have a speaker ban law which drew a lot of objection at the time, and then now we have speakers banned, and that's supposed to be the way it is, and so we have to have a speaker ban with...
I used some of that in my argument on the floor when we were presenting the bill to the House. I actually used some of that because it's exactly on point.
Of course, the logic of some was, well, that was the legislature telling the university it can't have speakers. But the university should be able to have academic freedom to say no to speakers. And how the legislature is, how dare they infringe on our academic freedom to suppress speakers? I mean, I'm sort of kidding, but not really.
No, you're not really.
I think we're out of time, unfortunately. Thank you all so much for coming. And thank you to the National Association of Scholars and to the John Locke Foundation for being excellent partners to get this event together. NAS for really spearheading the whole thing and presenting this excellent new research. Also, I want to thank all of our speakers, so if you could join me in giving a hand to our these are probably still also is literature out front. If you'd like to pick up some literature or purchase a book, they're probably, I think, still have all of that. But thank you all. Drive safely and stay in touch. Have a good night.